congratulations to EFCom for reaching this 25 years milestone. That's a tremendous achievement. Well done. Yeah, very happy to be here and being the opening session with Neal. Going to give a sort of overview, or Neal is going to give a kind of overview of what's going on in the world of factoring. And we're going to be talking a bit about AI and technology and the effect of that on the industry, and also a bit about the geopolitical position and how that's affecting the world of factoring today. But let's start off, Neal, with a quick, you've got a kind of unique view on the world of factoring, being with FCI and FCI having that sort of global position. Why don't you just give us a few insights and a quick overview of what FCI does, and then we'll move into something about the stats, which you control as well, thankfully, because I don't think anyone else does it.
Yeah, happy to do it. So first, thank you for the invitation. I came last year, first time, which was my first full year being at FCI. Maybe I'll be there for 25 years. We'll see if I can hit that same 25-year mark. But just really enjoyed last year. Being around people that are in the industry is something that just I've enjoyed doing for 30 years. I've been in your seats, for 30 years as a banker, also as a non-banker, always in the factoring space, always in the supply chain space. The one thing that was consistent was always around open account finance. And as Michael said, I'm in a really unique position that I get to spend time like this with people in different countries. And even though the language is very different in each of these countries, what we're talking about is the exact same thing. It's a risk issue. It's an invoice. How do I get paid back? How do I finance my client? How do I become more digital? How do I become more efficient? And it's really interesting to hear that in different languages and different cultures. Again, the culture and the language is different, but what we do is exactly the same thing. I was in Singapore 2 weeks ago having this conversation. I was in Algiers last week having this conversation. We were in Warsaw in Poland 2 days ago having the same conversation. And it's very unique to have that experience and hear what's going on in the market. And we'll share a little bit about, hopefully with you this morning. But just for some background, FCI. So FCI is a network. We are 57 years old. It's a network that was started in the northwestern part of Europe, and we're now in 90 countries with 400 members in those different countries. A few in the audience here today. And I use that term network very purposefully. Legally, I'm an association of members, but I use the term network very purposefully because what we do is we connect our members to each other. So our members use the efcom platform as an example. efcom connects into my network, and then I push that information to China, Hong Kong, Peru, and other parts of the world so that our members, you, have the ability to do cross-border transactions safely and securely. Everything we do is around open account. If you're familiar with SWIFT, which Sybos will be here in your backyard in the next week or two, we're just like SWIFT. SWIFT is communicating with financial institutions all over the world for letters of credit. We're doing the exact same thing on an open account basis.
Neal, tell us a bit about how the industry's been performing in the last 12 months and the trends in recent years.
Yeah.
I mean, over the last 20 or 30 years, factoring has been a real success story around the globe, particularly in Europe. And I understand we're about, 4 trillion euros in total global volume at the moment?
Yeah.
So you produce the annual statistics. Nobody else is doing that, as far as I know. Just give us an overview of the performance.
What we're seeing?
Yeah.
So it's actually very consistent. If you take a step back and look at the countries, you'll see ups and downs, no question, and you can comment on each one of those countries. But the one thing that's consistent in every one of those countries, if you look at GDP as the benchmark, and you look at GDP as it's moving up or down in any of these markets, the one consistent thing across almost every market that we track is that factoring, open account finance, grows faster than GDP moves. And you see that consistently everywhere that we've been. Again, Poland yesterday or the day before, And it was commented that I believe their factoring growth was around 6 or 7% as a market. GDP growth was around, I believe it was around 3%, if I'm not mistaken. And that's consistent everywhere that we go. And that's a very positive thing for this market, and it shows that it's a continued growth opportunity for anybody that's in this industry. One thing that we've seen is that when regulation and law is put in place, open account finance skyrockets. A study that was done by Unidroit last year looked at the markets that we've entered as an industry, and we've brought the model law of factoring to that country. Trade finance has grown 25% year over year the first 5 years that those laws are brought in place. So it shows the value of this product around open account finance. And that's the one consistent theme that we see globally year over year, is that factoring grew about 3% last year. Manufactured trade globally grew about 1%. So again, it's a good story for us as an industry when you compare our growth rate compared to the industries that we support, which is mainly manufactured trade.
So we're seeing tremendous growth in emerging markets, particularly when new laws are introduced to promote factoring and enable factoring. But even in mature markets, we're still seeing growth above GDP.
Definitely. Not as fast, but yes. Yeah.
So recently, we've seen a lot of geopolitical conflict and impact on trade, impacts on trade corridors.
Yeah.
How is that impacting factoring, international factoring?
Yeah. So I think I get this question quite a bit, especially in bars late at night. I'm from the U.S. And we know where some of this chaos, as I call it, comes from. But if you take a step back and you look at trade over the decades, and you really should look at trade movement not in years but in decades. What's happening right now, this chaos that's happening right now, is really a point in time, and it's highlighting some things that have been happening for, again, decades. And the best example that I can give on that is what we're seeing with China. China had been an east-west trade flow for the most part the past 2 to 3 decades. What we're now seeing is that trade flow is starting to go 2 directions. One is inside the continent of Asia, and the second is more north-south. And one of the best examples of that is South America. China has invested significantly in the port in Peru, and they are just now about to receive their first ship from China to Peru. It's happening as we speak. It should arrive in the next day or 2 days. That is going to be an amazing corridor from Asia into South America. And if you look at that 20 years ago, that entire market, South America, the primary trading partner was North America. Today, if you look at that, the primary trading partner with every single country in South America is China. And the exact same thing is happening in Africa. If you look at Africa 20 years ago, you looked at those countries and you could pick out the countries based on their French background or their English background in terms of where some of their trading partners were. You look at that same map today, it's 100% China. So it's something that we need to be aware of. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's the reality of trade and that it moves. So some of this chaos that we're seeing with the trade wars definitely impacts some of the short-term trade. We were talking about soybeans earlier today as an example. To me, that's a short-term blip in the decades-long view of anything. Because these trade flows were already starting to move. I think it's just been highlighted, and I think it's been brought to a lot of people's attentions because of some of the chaos that's happening right now.
And factoring always tends to adapt to all these changes and this evolution. It's always been successful despite blips and impacts on trade in the past. But central to factoring operations over the last 25 years has always been technology. And we've seen quite a bit of advancement and changes and development in technology over that period. What do you see as been the sort of major milestones in terms of technology development and movement in that?
Yeah. So I'll start off with, on a personal level, while the intros were being done in German, I had on my Google Translate, and I was getting probably 85% of it right. I'm sure there were some numbers there that weren't perfect, But I think that's such a good example of how the world positively is being brought together with technology. And the same thing is happening in trade. You're starting to see the invoice, the bill of lading, the payment, the shipping documents becoming more digital, which is allowing trade to move faster, more streamlined, more efficient. You're seeing that the SME market is able to access capital that it could not access before because of that efficiency. A personal story on that. I ran a small factoring company for Bank of America very early in my career, and we used to price the operational cost of an invoice at $25 US. So every invoice that my operational team touched, we had a operating model of $25 US. Now that wasn't the credit, that was strictly the operations. Getting the invoice in the mail, opening it up, keying it into the system, making the phone call to say, hey, JCPenney's, did you get this order? It was received. We called them a couple weeks later and said, are you going to pay us? Yes, here's your check. It was $25 US to process an invoice. I don't know what efcom, Federico has as a model, but it's probably pennies, today. So that's an extreme example, but when you go to an SME who has very small invoices and a lot of little invoices, you can now reach that market that you could not reach 5, 10, 20 years ago. So we're seeing significant advances as things become more and more digital. And I think the positive to that is it brings the product closer to the SME market over time.
But conversely, I think that trend is certainly, we can see that in emerging markets.
Yeah.
And technology is enabling factoring and finance to reach those SMEs, particularly in emerging markets. But we were talking about it earlier, but I've noticed a trend. UK is a good example in more mature markets where there has been a move towards factoring and receivables finance being used by larger businesses.
Yeah.
And we've certainly seen that in the UK. In the UK over the last few years, the number of clients using factoring has reduced from about 42,000 to now about just over 30,000. Volumes have increased and gone up, but the number of users and clients of factoring and invoice discounting has decreased, and that's because there are larger larger clients using the services, factoring and invoice discounting, particularly invoice discounting, and reverse factoring, supply chain finance. But the result of that is that maybe the SMEs are not being served in the same way they used to. I mean, is that a concern for the industry? Are we going to see that trend in developing markets eventually as they mature? Do you think they're going to move more towards larger clients because of technology sort of enabling that and sort of moving things in that direction? How do you see that panning out?
No, I think it's a really good point. And in the developed markets, UK is an example, the benefit to the SME and other markets is the benefit to the larger corporate. They're becoming extremely efficient when it comes to receivables finance at the large corporate level. They can push hundreds of thousands an invoice in seconds. Again, used to be extremely manual. So I do think the HSBCs of the world, as an example, have gone up market with a product that used to be more middle market in SME. So I'll say that it's creating disruption. Maybe there's a little bit of chaos. One of my favorite things is there's always opportunity in chaos. I think there's an opportunity there for those middle market SME banks and non-banks to really get into the market, because the bigger banks of the world are focusing their attention on the larger corporates because it's better for their balance sheet, right? It's a bigger piece of business. But I think and there are players in this room right now that I know that are in the non-bank space that I think there's an opportunity. We were speaking earlier this morning, right? I think there's an opportunity for players in that space because of it. But I think you're right. In the short term, it is creating some disruption. I think some of the SMEs and the developed markets are losing out short term. But again, I think there's an opportunity there for many of the non-bank and the smaller bank players.
Do you think AI is going to help that space in terms of reaching out to the smaller SMEs?
I think it can. I think again, it's the technology piece. I'm looking forward to seeing where AI goes long term, just in our industry. I'm not a fan of it being a decision maker yet. Maybe that happens at some point in time. When I think about AI, I use the term, it's more form over function. It's great for bringing data together. It's great for organizing that data in a way that I can look at it quicker, but you've got to be really careful with what is in that data. And I think that's the thing that needs to be fixed over the next few years, is how do you validate that this search that's being done across the data globally, the information that's coming back is accurate. But I do think it's great time saver of aggregating the data, putting it in a form that we can look at quicker, but we need to figure out better ways to validate that data.
Yeah, I guess it's not really clear yet, or we don't quite know how AI is going to fully impact the sector.
Yeah.
How it might help in reaching SMEs particularly. And how it might impact the trade finance gap. That's always talked about a lot. That's been an issue for decades and decades. Is it going to help in reducing that trade finance gap? Well, what about autonomous decision making and AI? Is that a good thing? Is that a risky thing? Is that going to cause problems? I mean, is it going to, how is fraud going to be impacted by that? Is that going to enable fraudsters to find a new way in?
Path. Yeah, it will, right? It makes everybody more efficient, the fraudsters and the non-fraudsters, ultimately. So I think it's where we have to be careful with it. Again, I'm not at a point that I would be comfortable with AI making a credit decision. I am comfortable with it helping me plan out my itinerary. I'll go into ChatGPT and say I need to be in Warsaw, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam over 4 days. What's the best way to do it? It comes back with a really good itinerary. Now, I still need to fact check it to make sure that that train schedule really exists, that it says is there. So I'm not going to let it make that decision for me. But again, the information that it can bring to me, and I think for any of us in the room that need to make financial decisions, I think it can help us form the decision. I'm not sure I'm ready to let it make the decision for me yet.
So do you see it coming into all aspects of factoring operations, audit, credit control, marketing?
I think it will. Again, where I'm cautious on it is, and I've seen this even with our small group, is people assume that they can just put information into ChatGPT as an example, and it's going to give them information back. What they don't realize is you could be putting very confidential data out there in the internet for everybody to see at that point in time. And I think that is something that's not understood yet. That AI is good, but the reason it's good is because it's taking all of this information to help make a decision. Well, if you're feeding it that information, it's confidential information, you've crossed a line that you shouldn't have crossed. Within FCI, we actually have a small example of this. If you go to our website, we've got a little blurb in the bottom right corner. If you click on it, you can put in a question and say, how old is FCI? And it'll come back in and it will tell you. Now, when we put that together, we were very careful to make sure that it only pulls from our public data and it only pulls from our data when it does it. And as it returns answers, it does not send that back out to the vendor that we're using for it. So again, I think if it's used in the right space, it's good, but we have to be really careful with where that information is being delivered to. I think that's a risk that I don't think people are seeing yet.
Can I move on to education and how important that is? I know that's a real important aspect of FCI, maybe even a core of one of the cores of FCI's operations. In many emerging markets, it's quite difficult to get banks to really get the idea of how factoring can help SMEs and get them on board. There seems to be some resistance in some markets. Look at Central Asia, for example. Why is that, do you think, and what can be done to develop the sector more quickly in those areas?
I mean, it's being on the street, it's being in front of people. The best example I have of that is Zimbabwe. 2 years ago, one of my first events was in Zimbabwe. I got introduced to a bank called CBZ, the executive there, Fabian, that ran it. He came up at the end of the conference and said, I need to understand this better. I understand trade finance. I came from, I think, Citibank or somewhere before. He's like, but most of my bankers don't. Are you going to be here tomorrow? I said, yeah, I'm going to be around another day or two. So we went to his offices, and he brought a few bankers into the room, and he explained what factoring and invoice finance was. And one of the bankers said, well, we don't need this. You know, my clients have generational land. They have generational property and vehicles and cattle. They can lend against that. They don't need to lend against an invoice. And I said, well, let's talk about one of your clients. And the client that the banker brought up had about $3 million US in receivables in their company. And I said, that's $1 million, $2 million, $2.5 million in working capital that's just stuck in this company. So to me, it was a really good opportunity to see that it's just about education. Now, 12 to 18 months later, we just signed an agreement with African Exim Bank and CBZ where they are doing a participation facility to support them in factoring clients in CBZ in Zimbabwe. And their goal is to have their first launch of the business in January. So that education, that advocacy, that we do, it's a little costly. We do not see an immediate return when we go into a country like Zimbabwe or Nigeria or Algeria, but the long-term opportunity that it turns into is huge. And that's an impact for all of us in the industry, because that product that's being made in Zimbabwe at some point is going to make its way into Germany, or at some point Germany is going to be supporting a Zimbabwean supplier at some point.
I think it's very noticeable that the development banks are taking a much stronger interest in receivables finance, factoring, and payables finance. And I think there's a really strong recognition in recent years that this sector can make a really big impact in supporting the development of SMEs in emerging markets. And I think FCI are playing a much greater role in terms of working with development banks. Is that right?
Definitely. EBRD, African Exim Bank, IFC, Asian Development Bank have become really strong partners with us over the few years. And going back to that Zimbabwe example, FCI could never have gone into that country by ourselves and do what we did in that promotional and advocacy event. We did it because African Exim Bank provided the grant and the support, to get us there. And so we're trying to take that model and that journey, if you will, that we took this bank on, and we're trying to replicate that, in a Bangladesh with Asian Development Bank, or in South America with IDB and IFC and some of the markets that they support. So the development banks for us are critical because, again, we're really a small business. FCI is a very small nonprofit business, and so we have to rely on those grants and those support to be able to get into markets. Even efcom, efcom's been a great supporter of FCI and shown up at different places to allow us to be there to talk to people about this product because of the support that we get from someone like efcom as well.
We've got 5 or 6 minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes. Oh, we need a microphone.
Here we go.
Hi, my name is Dinko Mehmedagic. I'm working for Deutsche Bank and PB Factoring. 2 questions I would like to raise. One is you were speaking about opportunities and risks in the SME market. And from my perspective, on the risk side and challenges, I clearly see that there is an increasing regulation in a lot of markets, which means there is a lot of more administrative cost and challenges to find the right employees to support SMEs. The second thing is that on the investor side, it has become more challenging to raise capital for that business. And also on the refinancing side, not all the banks are so bullish because economies are a bit more challenged at the moment, specifically in Germany and some European markets. So that even on the refinancing part, not all the partners which have been there are so supportive as they could be. And also politics and some of the development banks that you mentioned, while maybe internationally are much more active, to be honest, I haven't seen them being as active in key markets like Germany and other big economies in Europe supporting that kind of business. I fully agree on the opportunities that you mentioned, specifically looking at technology, looking at new models of servicing clients in the fintech space. Still, the question for me would be, what is your perspective on what is the real, let's say, new developments on the technology? I mean, you mentioned AI, which everybody talks about, but have you really seen new developments really used by a larger number of players, or is this still in the quite early stage of development? Maybe if you could give a perspective there, and especially if it's possible from a European or German perspective, because I think a lot of the audience here is having a focus here on these markets. That would be question number one. And the second question would be with regards to new trends. I mean, next to AI, there's a lot of talk in other areas about where capital is going. A lot of discussion is about the crypto market and regulation changing there, not only on the coin base, but specifically on the stable coin base. I'm by myself looking a lot into that opportunity and developing something, but I haven't seen really many players being active there. So the allocation of capital, which is in the capital market, towards that kind of business, yes, I've seen the securitization market through ABS or ABCP, but to be honest, most likely for larger transactions, for larger players, but not for the mid or small market in that regard. Maybe you could give a perspective on this as a second question.
Yeah. You may have to help remind me some of the questions there. But from let me start with the regulatory piece. I think that's a very important one. And what I would really push everybody in the room is to be active with your German association. I'm very familiar with it from EUF. EUF and FCI have a very close relationship with each other. The work that they do from an advocacy perspective is very important. Some of the late payment regulation, the dispute laws that are coming out there, had those regulations been put in place the way they were drafted, it would have really hurt the financial market, no question, in Europe. Germany, definitely. Example that I'll use to that is one that was put in place in California 4 or 5 years ago. And what California wanted, which was a good thing, they wanted to make sure that a borrower, a client, an SME, knew the true cost of their capital. The problem when you factor is if you have a 2% discount, how much of that 2% discount is interest, and how much is service, how much of it is credit protection. And we really had to spend time with the regulators back in California to say, that 2% discount, if I turn that into an interest rate, it's 36%, right? The reality is it's not 36%. The interest portion was probably 0.75 of the 200 that was in it, or the 2.0. So there's education, there's advocacy. That's where I really, any market that I go into, I think it's so important that you have that industry body. It's not a quick fix, but it's important to have that conversation built between you and the regulators so that when they have this idea that they think is a good thing in the market, they're coming back to you first before they take it publicly. So that would be one from the regulatory. On the SME front, and was it around automation? Yeah. I am not seeing that help yet. I do think a lot of the technology advances the past 20 years or so where we're getting invoices more automated is a really positive thing. But from a payments perspective, that's something that needs to be figured out. Will a stable coin like XRP take the place of SWIFT at some point in time? I think it definitely can, no question, especially if you're in a market that's not USD driven, other market currency driven. So I think there are definitely going to be opportunities there. I don't think we're seeing any of it today. I mean, I don't think we're seeing the impact. There are some big public announcements about a stable coin and a fully digital trade transaction. But when you look at the transaction, it was a multi-million-dollar single commodity that was moved. Does that really help the SME, right? So it's good, conceptual, but longer term, I think it's going to take us a while before we get there. Did I catch all the questions there?
Yeah. I think on securitization, I think there's a general trend for deal sizes to be coming down. I think in the area of trade receivables securitization, that is growing, and I think that is developing. And I think we will see in the not too distant future opportunities in securitization to support smaller factoring operations and independent factoring operations. I think it's always been a problem in doing that because of the small amounts involved for independent factors. But I now But there is a trend now, I think, of working towards being able to, from various different sources, pool receivables into a single conduit and to create securitization deals which are at the level which can be done and as a result get that support to the independents. And you mentioned the development banks as well, and not supporting markets like Germany. And their remit really is in emerging markets. So, you know, that's what they're set up for. You won't really get them paying too much attention to the more mature markets. You know, that's the way it is, really, with development banks. We're a little bit just over time, I think. Can we
a little bit? Yes.
Time for one more question, if there is one. But,
if any more questions arise, please
Or coffee break.
look at those faces of the two gentlemen, and
they were sorry you had to have those up
you
there
may
the whole
try
time.
to use the networking to ask the questions so that we proceed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
oh.
Okay, now, first of all, Michael, also congratulations to you, BCR, for your 25 years also.
Yeah.
So this is also an achievement for BCR Publishing. One question for you, Neal. Development of import and export factoring. I mean, you've got the numbers, you know what's going on. Where do you see this heading? Is it going to stay stable as it is right now, or are you going to see faster increases due to technology or any other impulses?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm very fortunate is that I'm seeing the data live in our network. And what's been interesting is the credit request. So obviously before you can have the invoice, you've got to have an approved seller and buyer transaction. We're seeing that credit request in our systems, and we're seeing a huge pickup intra-continent and also intra-country. So we're seeing, you know, a region of China asking another region of China for support in the two-factor model, which used to be international, and now it's domestic. The United States, we're seeing the same thing where two factors are working together to support a seller on the East Coast versus a buyer on the West Coast. So we're seeing more intra-continent and intra-country trade, and we're really seeing that starting to grow within the market.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the morning. We enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.